Do you believe that raising capital is something to be celebrated, but burning cash is something bad? I teach an MBA class at IIM Bangalore, and almost all my students believe that raising money is good, but burning cash is bad. But this is a paradox. It is absurd because raising capital and cash burn are two sides of the same coin. Every time a startup raises capital, it must always be followed by cash burn. No exceptions. Why? To understand this, you must first understand some basic principles of cash accounting, and that is the focus of this video. But before we get to cash accounting, let me clarify two things. When I say that raising capital always leads to cash burn, some students assume that this is because founders develop bad habits after raising capital and spend money on silly things, which causes cash burn. No, I don't mean this. It doesn't matter how good or bad a founder is. If a startup raises capital, it must always have subsequent cash burn. Some students assume that this is because startups that are cash positive or profitable cannot raise venture capital because VCs for some reason only fund cash burning startups. Again, I don't mean this, and this is not true either. If a founder is running a tight, profitable startup, it gives me as a VC more confidence in the founder's execution ability. So I would be more inclined to invest, not less. When I say if a startup raises capital, it must always have subsequent cash burn, I mean it precisely, mathematically. Even if an incredibly cash positive and profitable startup were to raise capital, it will become cash negative and start burning cash after it has raised capital. To understand why, you will need to understand the basics of how cash accounting works and how accountants define the term cash burn. So put your seatbelts on. This is going to get mildly technical. Accountants categorize all possible uses of cash in a company in just three categories. The first category is operations. A company collects cash from customers by selling its goods and services. And the company uses cash to pay salaries, to pay for marketing, for R&D, and to pay any interest due. In any year, all the cash collected by operations minus all the cash used in operations gives you the company's operating cash flow, or OCF. This is a very simple concept. Cash in minus cash out due to operations is OCF. Next, the second category for the use of cash is capital investment. When a company buys any assets like machinery or land, accountants call it capital investment. A company may also sell such assets and receive cash. In a year, all the cash collected by selling any machinery and land minus all the cash used to buy machinery and land gives you the company's investing cash flow. Accountants also use a common term for the negative of investing cash flow called capital expenditure, or CAPEX, because usually companies spend more money to buy machinery and land than they collect by selling such assets. The third and final category is fundraise. All the cash that a company raises in a year as equity or debt minus all the cash that the company returns to shareholders and debt holders as share buyback, debt principal repayment, or dividend gives you the company's financing cash flow, or net fundraise. Now, because these are the only three categories for use of cash, if you add up all the three cash flows, you will get the number by which the company's cash pile will change in any year. So all the net cash collected by operations minus all the net cash used to buy machinery plus all the net cash raised from equity or debt investors gives you the amount by which the company's cash pile will increase or decrease. In an equation form, OCF minus CAPEX plus net fundraise is equal to the change in the company's cash pile. Now, accountants define cash burn as the sum of the first two categories of cash flow. So, Cash burn is defined as OCF minus capex. This should be intuitive. If the company generates excess cash in its operations and does not use all that excess in buying machinery, then the company will be called cash positive. In an equation form, if OCF minus capex is positive, the company is cash positive. If OCF minus capex is negative, the company is cash negative. If OCF minus capex is 0, the company is break even on cash. Now, for startups, capital returned is 0 for a very long time. Startups don't pay dividends, don't buy back shares, and don't usually have significant debt principal repayments. This means that startups always have positive or 0 net fund raise, because startups may raise cash as equity or debt but never return any cash to investors for a very long time. So, if a startup is cash positive in any period, this means that the cash pile of the startup will only increase. There is no way that the cash pile of a startup can decrease if it is cash positive. Again, this should be intuitive. If a startup is cash positive, it means that it is generating excess cash. And if excess cash cannot be returned to investors, then the startup's cash pile can only increase. I call this the startup cash rule. In any period, if a startup is cash positive, its cash pile will increase. This is the takeaway that you should remember. Even if you did not fully understand cash accounting, remember the startup cash rule, and let's use it now in an example. Suppose you start a startup today with $100 of your own money that you deposit in the startup's bank account as seed capital. So, how much is the cash pile of the company at this moment? It is $100, the amount that you just deposited in the bank account. Now, suppose that you ran the startup for a year. You did well and the startup broke even, which means that cash generated by operations minus cash used to buy machinery, etc. was 0. Also assume that you did not raise or return any capital, so that the net fund raised was also 0. Now, can you figure out the startup's cash pile at the end of year 1? The startup began the year with a cash pile of $100 and broke even in the year. So, what is the cash pile at the end of the year? Well, it is still $100. The cash pile did not change because the startup broke even and did not return any capital. So it did not need any cash from the cash pile this year. Now suppose that exactly at this moment, at the end of year 1, a VC invested $1 million in your startup. How much would the cash pile become after the VC investment? $1,100,000, because the VC investment will enter the startup's bank account and get added to the $100 that was already there. Now suppose that you ran the startup for another year and did even better. This year, the startup was cash positive and earned $200, which means that the startup generated $200 of excess cash through its operations, even after spending any cash the startup needed to buy any machinery, etc. Also, assume that there was no other fundraise or capital return in year 2 other than the VC investment we already spoke about. So, can you figure out what was the startup's cash pile at the end of year 2? Your startup did well, it generated excess cash. So what was the cash pile at the end of year 2? $1,300,000. The excess $200 generated simply got added to the cash pile. So, what happened to the $1 million that you raised at the beginning of year 2? Think about it. What happened to the VC money? If the VC comes to your next board meeting and asks you, what happened to the money I invested at the beginning of the year? What did you do with it? What would be your answer? Well, nothing. You did nothing with that money. The money was sitting idle in the startup's bank account all year. The startup did not use anything from the cash pile in year 2, either for its operations or for buying machinery. Instead, the startup had excess $200 left over after using whatever it needed for operations as well as machinery. So, the VC money was sitting idle in the bank account. Then, why did you raise the VC money in the first place? To have the money sit idle in your bank account? And why did the VC invest in your startup if your plan was for the money to sit idle in a bank? The only reason you raised money is to fund your planned cash burn. So you can spend cash today on more marketing, more R&D, hiring people, etc. to develop and grow your startup in the future. And this spending today will make your startup cash negative. And if you don't spend enough after raising money and your startup remains cash positive, it means that your operations are generating so much cash that you can fund everything you need from your operations alone. So any capital you raised will just sit idle in the startup's cash pile. And this is clearly senseless. This is why any fundraise will always lead to subsequent cash burn. Now, don't get me wrong. Nothing I have said so far should lead you to believe that raising capital from investors and spending it on reckless items is a good thing. It is not. Of course, you should use capital judiciously, only on items that would help you build or grow your startup. My point is that the term cash burn is an accounting construct, and if a startup raises any capital, that raise must be followed by cash burn, unless the startup keeps the capital idle in its bank account. Moving on, there is also a corollary to the startup cash rule. It is that the amount of money a startup raises will be approximately equal to the subsequent cash burn that the startup will have. Because, using the same logic as before, suppose you raised $10 million and were able to use only $3 million of that capital before your startup turned cash positive. Then, of those $10 million, $7 million would be left in your bank account. And if you stay cash positive from that point onward, then those $7 million will just remain idle in your bank. And the question in front of you would be, has your startup now exhausted all possible growth opportunities that could have been exploited by deploying those $7 million? If your startup still has growth opportunities left, why would you not deploy the remaining $7 million to pursue those growth opportunities? If this line of reasoning still does not feel intuitive to you, just understand that the way accounting works, any use of capital or any deployment of capital other than returning capital to investors ends up being reported by accountants as cash burn. So, a startup that has raised either debt or equity capital has only two options: to use that capital or not to use that capital. If the startup chooses option 1, to use capital, then that use will always end up reported by accountants as cash burn. It does not matter what that use is: product development, R&D, marketing, sales, or customer support. Any use will be reported as cash burn. And if the startup chooses option 2, not to use that capital, then the capital will sit idle in a bank. Summarizing our discussion so far, a startup raises capital to spend more than its current collections in the hope of producing much larger profits in the future. Accountants call this spending cash burn. And for most startups, cash burn and loss are almost the same if the effect of accrual accounting adjustments like capitalization, depreciation, and working capital changes is not significant. Accrual is a more advanced accounting topic. You just need to know that for the vast majority of startups out there, cash burn and loss will be quite similar because the effect of accrual accounting adjustments would usually be small. Let's discuss more about the idea of loss in the next video. Hey there, I'm KJ Saxena, founder of Relentless VC. The video you just watched is part of the Venture Capital and Entrepreneurship specialization, which is available absolutely for free on relentless.ventures. Go check it out. If you're a tech startup founder and want to raise money from us, you should apply on our website. Lastly, if you like this video, do subscribe and share it with your friends.